Welcome to part 6 and the final installment of our series about demystifying strategic planning. In today's episode, we're talking about why are we doing this anyway in regards to running our businesses. Ron talks about the way our why keeps us going, just like petrol in the car, and we discuss how to find your why. Well, welcome to the Business Builders Podcast. We're your hosts. I'm Brenton Gowland.
And I'm Ron Tomlin.
And Ron, it's a bit of a sad day. We've come to the end of our Demystifying Strategic Planning series. This is the last episode today.
I'm sure we could delve down into other subjects later on, but yep, that's the last one today.
Yeah, well, as you know, as we've gone through the series, we've identified a number of topics we could do whole shows on, and it's actually great to get to this point where we're wrapping up a series. And if you're listening, this is the first time we've done a series, but we're going to do more. You'll hear about that a little bit later in the show. But today we're rounding out what's been so far a really good series about making strategic planning simple and accessible to as many people as possible. And that's what we're all about here. We're about building businesses on the Business Builders Podcast.
Absolutely.
So, Ron, let's do a little bit of a recap. What are the 4 questions that we have covered off in this strategic planning process?
So all strategic planning can be boiled down to being able to answer for an organization 4 essential questions. Where are we now? Where do we want to be? How do we get there? How will we know when we've arrived? And the last one that we're going to talk about today, why are we doing this in the first place?
And that's the 5th question. That's the one you threw in at the end there.
That's right.
Cool. So before you get into it though, and we know that if you've been listening, you've heard us say those 5 questions really time and time again. But part of the reason we do that is so that it burns into our psyche. So when you do come to do strategic planning in your business, that you've got those 5 questions ringing in your ears as you go through the process. We want to start with our sponsors, Ron.
So, SA Business Builders.
We had our first event for the year about a week ago.
Yeah, and fantastic it was too.
Yes.
At Chateau Apollo there on Frome Street.
And if you're listening internationally, we know that means nothing to you, but we got a group of people together, CEOs and young guns. That's our focus this year, bringing the 2 together. So young business professionals and CEOs, so that we can basically cross-mentor each other. And, you know, there's real benefits in CEOs who've got a lot of experience learning from younger people. And of course, there's a lot of experience in finding mentors who have been there before you and can actually help you pave the way as you build your business career.
And it was great to see the interaction between those 2 groups on the night. So Well done.
Yeah, and just an interesting thing, we're having panel sessions with SA Business Builders now, and our idea is to have at least 1 young gun on the panel and 1 experienced CEO. So that's kind of going to be our pattern for the year. But yeah, it was a good show, even though we had a few people that weren't able to be there because of COVID, but we're getting used to living with COVID now, so we're not going to let that hold us back anymore, are we, Ron?
No, you can't be constrained by that anymore. There's no excuses.
Exactly. And our other sponsor is Adaptco, which is my business. So we're basically doing outsourced marketing and strategic work with organizations. So if you need a CMO to work within your business, whether it be 1 or 2 days a week or on specific projects, then hit me up and I will be able to help you. So that is our sponsors for this week, Ron.
Very good.
So back to our topic, and as you kind of indicated earlier, this is a question that we kind of threw in at the end. You know, strategic planning is those key 4 questions that go from where do we start from to how do we know that we've got there. But then we threw this question in at the end as a final question. Now, tell us about this final question in our series.
Well, let's just go back a little bit. People can answer what we do because that's the purpose of their organization. It's what you produce. Most people can articulate this. They can also articulate that how they do what they do because, quite frankly, that is more about how am I different from the opposition. There are other people who do what I do, but how am I different from them? And people can usually articulate that I'm faster, better, cheaper, better quality, those type of things.
All the hallmarks of innovation.
Yeah. And that's usually the basis of your marketing messages. But sitting behind that is the core of why you do what you do. Right? And a lot of people have never thought about this, and a lot of people struggle with it. And it's a really important question. It's a difficult question to answer, but it's an important question because it gets to the DNA of your organization. Mm-hmm. It gets to what makes you tick, why what motivates you and what motivates your organization to do what they do. So it's a really important question to be able to answer.
Yeah, absolutely. It kind of aligns with that thinking of why do you get out of bed in the morning, yeah?
Well, it is that. It is why do you get out of bed in the morning? What makes you do what you do? And understanding it is really important because as Simon Sinek says, and I'm a great fan of his thinking, people don't buy what you do, they buy why you do it. And that's because all purchases, I don't care whether we're talking about government agencies or down to the individual, emotion is an important part of it. And even for government agencies or businesses, confidence is an emotion that is invoked by the way people present themselves.
Or a brand, yeah.
Yeah. So emotion plays an important part, and emotion gets to the why of what organizations are doing. And it's that core question of what is the driving force behind your organization? What is the driving thought behind your organization? So it's really important that you can articulate that. If you don't know why would your customers buy from you? Okay. They're not going to know why until you are able to articulate this. And when I say you, I'm talking about people within the organization. Everyone should understand their why.
Okay, so let's talk about this then. So we've been talking about strategy for the last 5 episodes. Why is important for the strategic planning process, Ron?
Well, I like to use the analogy that we've been using before. Why is the fuel behind the trip that we're going to take?
So from the map analogy?
Yeah, using the map analogy, the why is the fuel. It's what gets you going. It's what keeps you going. And you can use the different types of fuel. Mm-hmm. If you're on the base grade ethanol, you can get there.
It's a bit harsh on the tank.
Yeah, very harsh on the engine. Yeah. But if you're using the Premium 98, it makes things run a lot more smoothly.
So if this is the first episode that you've joined us for, we've been using a map analogy right from the start. And that makes incredible sense that it's the fuel that drives us. So what does that look like then within the organization in a practical sense when that why is, one, understood, but then put into action?
Okay, so it's important for customers, as we've just established. It's the basis on which they differentiate between you and other people. But just as importantly, I think probably more importantly, it's what inspires people within the organization, firstly, to be part of it. And at a time when everyone's looking to recruit people, that becomes an important differentiator for your organization. But it's the what gets me out of bed in the morning question. If what gets you out of bed in the morning is, I just need to make some money and do a job, it's not particularly inspiring, and absenteeism is probably likely to be a problem for that organization. But if what gets you out of bed in the morning is, I'm inspired by what the organization is there for and what it's trying to achieve, and the big picture, that's the discretionary effort that everyone is looking for. That's the extra energy.
And of course, we were having a discussion about this earlier. So the why affects your vision and your values, which we've talked about before. And you've just been talking about getting the right people in the right mindset. So it's the values of the organization. It kind of filters. And we were talking about the fact that in organizations, you'll have those people watching the clock, and you know that they're the people who are just there because they need a paycheck, but their heart's not in it. And then there's those people, and it's not about working extra hours, but it's about who are passionately believing in the business from the inside. So it's one thing having customers believe in the business, but if you have staff in the business, like you were talking about, if the why then indicates if you're using premium fuel or rocket fuel, whatever it is, that's really supercharging your organization. And that's going to make a huge difference if you've got passionate people there to make that business everything it can be and to implement and put into action the strategy that you put into place.
Absolutely. And it should influence that strategy as well. Another author that I'm a great fan of, Daniel Pink, talks about what motivates people and the science behind motivation of individuals. He talks about 3 things. Number 1, mastery. Number 2, self-direction. And third is being able to make a contribution, or if you like, the transcendent purpose of the organization. Now, going back to the 4 questions you need to ask as a basis. Where are we now? Where do we want to be is the vision for the organization. And I've said before in our discussion, it's time limited. So by such and such a date, this is where we want to be. But think of the why, answering the question, why do we do this, as the transcendent purpose, the long-term vision for the organization. In the end, which you never get to anyway, in the long run, this is what we want to achieve. And it might be a more sustainable world. It might be harmony amongst people. It's usually something that is a desired end state for more than just the organization. It's a contribution towards an ideal. And that's, if you like, the long-term vision for the organization, not just the organization, but the environment that it works within.
And let's be honest, every business owner or CEO, I would imagine, would want that to be how their staff, how the people who are running the business think, that they're actually connected. The real challenge and the real skill, because you were talking about mastery and, those items which, help
mastery and self-direction.
Yep. It's that ability to inspire as well. I work in one business where I remember, there's one of the managers in this business has said, I want to spend the rest of my career here because I love what's being created. I love what the owner of the business has put in place, and I love the people here, and I just want to keep going. Now, his thinking may change in a few years if the personality of the business changes, but in that business, there's an inspiring leader at the top who's pushing people to achieve more. And that makes a huge difference as well. But that person has a why that's driving them. And that why then translates through to the rest of the company.
Let's put forward an example. Let's think about an industry, well, any industry. Let's think of the solar installers at the moment. Okay. So you've got two companies. Both of them are installing solar. One company, in terms of articulating its purpose or its why, says, well, we do this so that we can make money. Now, that's not particularly inspiring for customers. They might still do a good job. They might have technical expertise in that area, but it's a kind of, well, I don't really want to know about your profitability and so on. And it's not particularly inspiring for the employees either, because it's all they're doing is trying to make money. And it's there's nothing wrong with making money, but it's not the reason that I come to you, and it's not the reason I work here, because it's about you. It's not about your customers or about the society I live in. Take another company doing exactly the same thing, installing solar, who says our why is to make this a more sustainable world, to make us less reliant on fossil fuels and create an environment that we can sustain forever.
And a future for our kids.
Yeah. I got to say, that's more inspiring. As a customer, that's the company I'd want to deal with. And as an employee, that's the company I'd want to work for.
Well, as a customer, it says to me that these people look after their employees because they're interested in the future and they have a value set that aligns with, what we're thinking. So yeah, that is a very different proposition.
Yeah. And it's also, it creates strategies and actions that are congruent, in line with that philosophy. So you know that if that's the purpose of the why for the organization, you can imply or infer a number of different things about the organization. As you say, they'll look after their employees. They'll look after my place because they want the environment to be better. They care about people. There's a whole bunch of implied values that go with, if this is what inspires them, I want that too, so we're aligned.
Exactly. So we were just talking about, and I think the really important question then becomes, how do we establish our why? I gave you the example of the inspiring leader. That leader has a why, but I know from working in that business, they haven't necessarily articulated it through the business, and not everyone could necessarily answer it. But because his why is so strong, people follow it, right? But they haven't put it into verbal practice. You were just talking about a solar company who has put it into practice as a differentiator and also as what drives them to their business. So how do you find that why?
Yeah, it's a good question. How do you get to the point where you can articulate that to everyone within the organization and outside the organization?
Because that inspiring leader, I said, if they could actually articulate their why and every employee can understand it, that business will go from where it already is, from good to great. And I'm probably referencing that book.
Good to great.
We'll talk about that another day. But you know what I mean? If that leader can get that why out, then that'll make a huge difference to the business.
And it needs to be led, but there's processes, and it's not a difficult process. If you can articulate a sentence, and that it requires some effort on the part of the people who are involved in the organization, and particularly the leadership of the organization. Our why is to what contribution you want to make, so that what impact we are going to have. Our why is to install the best solar equipment on people's houses so that we can create a more sustainable future for our country or our environment. Yeah, it's as simple as that. But it's a matter of really getting down to the basics of being able to answer those questions. What's our why? So what contribution do we want to make, and what impact do we want to have?
Now, I've done this for a number of different businesses, and I've observed this as well, is that statement that you've just talked about sometimes is really difficult for people to put into words, particularly when they've been in an organization for a long while, because they're so close to it that actually sometimes finding that thing which seems so simple can be very, very difficult. So I've worked with 3 companies now where I've actually written their why by interviewing all their staff, and then they've gone, wowee, that's it. So that's an interesting experience. So how often does that happen? But how can that organization get to find ways to make that statement something they can actually write themselves?
I think it's like with so many different things. It's like with leadership. You know, I deal with people all the time who are leading organizations, and it starts with self-awareness. Okay. In the case of the organization, starts with organizational awareness. Yeah. How do you get an awareness of what you're like? It's by asking other people. So as you said, sometimes you're too close to it. So talk to your customers, talk to your suppliers, talk to people who you interact with as an organization, and ask them, tell me more about the organization, what impresses you, what you see in us that maybe we don't see in ourselves. Get triangulation. And I love this analogy. You know, you talk about how do you find where something is? Well, the way that it's done in the military is to get information from 3 different points, and you triangulate from that. So get triangulation. Talk to a number of different people and get their perspectives, and feed that back to the organization and say, this is the way other people see us. How do we see ourselves? What's driving this? They seem to be inspired by this aspect of what we do. Have we missed that? Is that something that we're not seeing because we're too close to it?
Sometimes finding our why, based on what you're saying, and I love what you've said here, is actually a research piece as well. You got to go exploring. And that's so often true with things that we know intrinsically, but we don't know how to put into words. And I think that's what you've just shared there is really vital for people to actually come to a place of understanding their own business and the value that it contributes.
Yeah, it's sometimes difficult to really extricate your motivations. It's much easier to talk to other people about what they see and imply or infer those motivations in looking at yourself as an organization. I'm talking about. I think the same could be said of individuals as well. In fact, in his book, Start With Why, Simon Sinek says, and find your why. That's for the individual too. Yeah. So it's not just organizations that need to have an awareness of this. And if you're the leader of an organization, often the why for the organization is highly influenced, if not started by what is your why.
Well, when you're in a smaller business, I think it's the business owner who kind of carries the why. It's about what motivates them, etc. And that, people jump on board with that. And as the business gets larger, that of course spreads out to the way the business operates, and the management team and the way they kind of work could be leader-led depending on the way the business is structured. But, oftentimes it starts to become part of a greater whole.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's no question that if you've got a whole bunch of different people who have got all different sorts of whys and they've never looked at what is our common why, it might be that I'm inspired by the leader of the organization, and I think I know what his why is because that's what he talks about all the time. This is a relatively new idea that has been developed over the last 20 years or so, is to get this out on the table. The truth of the matter is it's been going on for hundreds of thousands of years in terms of society. People align themselves to other people who have the same motivation or the same idea about the way the world should be.
And I think we're starting to understand leadership better and the attributes of leadership, because good leaders have always been able to articulate their why in some fashion, even if they, in themselves, it's just like a built-in part of who they are. So that's really good. Now, but what about the scenario, Ron? Back to strategy and finding a why within our business. What if we get to the end of this journey of strategic planning and we realize once we've done all those interviews that we don't have a good why?
Well, you got to go back and develop it. And don't forget, strategic planning is not something that stops. Strategic planning, or the process of implementing plans, developing plans, implementing plans, and so on, is an ongoing process. So it doesn't matter if you don't have something at the moment or as a starting point. It might have been intrinsically there and just never articulated. For the next iteration, you've got the opportunity to start with that discussion. So don't think that I've got this beautiful plan, but it didn't have a why in it, so it's useless. Think of it as I can now implement in the next iteration of my planning cycle, I can implement this discussion or involve other people in this discussion so that the next iteration or the next change that we make. I mean, I'm a great fan of the idea of at least on a monthly basis having, depending on the size of the organization, having people sitting around talking about the strategy for the organization. You can inject this all the time because that will start to influence the next version or the next changes that happen in your strategic plan.
Fair enough. So if strategic planning keeps going on and on and on, the why becomes a constant part of that. And look, really, again, from my discussions before, it's almost like you really need to sit down and work out your why before you start doing the strategic planning. We're putting this in as the fifth question, but if you lead with why, if you go into the looking at where you are, understanding, does that actually align with our why? How have we got to where we are? And then you start looking at where you want to go, looking at vision, mission, values, and all these things. Why is a great influencer of how that's put together.
From my perspective, if you want a place to put this discussion, it's when you've finished your discussion about where are we now, and before you get into the vision and purpose of the organization, this is the place you put the discussion about the why. When you're having your discussion about values, and when you're having a discussion about where we're going to go from here, what will influence that, if this is the time-limited vision for the organization, let's say 5 years.
Yeah.
Okay. In the long run, what are we on about? What is our why will help shape that vision for that time limit period.
Well, it actually makes perfect sense because if you're looking at where are we now, the first question, why is a part of that?
Yes.
Is our why. And look, the reason I asked, what if you find out you don't have a great why? Let's say, for instance, your why gets to, we're here to sell a widget. Well, and there's a lot of companies that's their whole why, like you read their vision mission and it's, I want to sell the most widgets and be the best of the best of the best with honors. Thank you, sir.
Yes. And a good question to ask those people who have those, what I consider to be quite superficial visions for their organization. He's asked that question. Why? Why do you want that? I want to make a lot of money. Okay. Is that what you're on about? Just continually asking the question until you get the nub of, well, what really gets you going? And very rarely, I would say, very rarely people are about, I just want to make more and more and more and more and more money.
So what we need to do is come up with a why that really motivates us to, why are we in business? Why are we doing this? And that why then actually drives us to grow the business. And that's how strategy will work. Because if you put a strategy together and we're just going through the motion, sure, we might make a bit of extra money. But like we said earlier, there's no real jet fuel in the engine or premium fuel in the engine that's really going to make this car, make this bus, whatever it is, just hum with brilliance.
That's right. And it comes to the question of, and we could maybe do another podcast on this one, what is being able to answer for yourself and for the organization, what does success really look like? A lot of people's vision or idea of success is driven by external factors, what other people tell them, the next car, the next house. It's not particularly satisfying, and they then are struggling for what's next after that. Being able to articulate for yourself, what does success in life look like for me, and what does success in life look like for this organization is a very worthwhile discussion.
Great. And I think we'll wrap it up there. So that has been our series on demystifying strategic planning. And this last question was, why are we doing it anyway? And as we've kind of talked about, why becomes that motivator? It's that fuel that we put in the engine to get us there? Do we want a bumpy ride with high ethanol fuel, I think you were saying earlier, or do we want a really smooth ride with an engine that's got lots of torque and lots of power?
Or let's be contemporary, or do we want a perfectly smooth ride and go for electricity?
Wow, Elon Musk would be proud of that comment.
As an old electrical engineer, that was always my ideal.
Yeah, fantastic. So thank you for joining us for this series. We hope you've enjoyed it and we hope you've got some useful information out of it. What we're going to do over the next few weeks, we're going to look at interviewing a couple of people who've put what we've talked about into action. So actual business leaders that can come and talk about how they've implemented and facilitated and communicated strategy throughout their businesses and the difference it's made. And then at the back end of that, we're going to start a series on business development, which is one of the key aspects of really getting a business to grow. And that is, of course, not sales, but business development, which is an important distinction. But we'll talk about that in coming weeks, Ron.
Very good.
Okay, so thank you for listening, and it's bye from me.
And bye from me.